Good afternoon, everyone, or for those who are joining us in the US, good morning, actually. Uh, I'm Shahin Obadi, and I'll be moderating this panel today. Uh, the panel would be about the nuclear agreement with Iran, its consequences, the challenges, and the prospects. Uh, we have a very, very distinguished panelist with us this afternoon, Ambassador Ken Blackwell, who served the UN Human Rights Commission as the US ambassador for 2 years, and a very, very prominent US politician and very prominent commentator. Madam Linda Chavez, the former director of public liaison at the White House in the Reagan administration, and Dr. Sascha Sheehan, who is director of negotiations and conflict resolution at the University of Baltimore. And we will have some audience who will follow us live in Stockholm, Sweden. So allow me to welcome all of you to our panel discussion. A week just past Tuesday, after almost 2 years of very, very intense and grueling negotiations, the P5+1 reached an agreement with the Iranian regime trying to curb its nuclear program in return for some sort of a sanctions relief. Naturally, the agreement, the deal, has stirred a lot of debate, whether it's a good deal or a bad deal, and where does it lead us to. Everybody is quite cognizant of the consequences and what is at the stake. Now, just the other day, the Obama administration handed over the agreement to the US Congress, and for the next 60 days, the US Congress will review this and will provide its response to the agreement and what will happen afterwards. And naturally, there has been very, very intense debate about this in the region, and what does it mean for the region, what does it mean for the future course of events in Iran, and so on and so forth. So we thought it's very timely to have this panel discussion with our distinguished panelists. So in the beginning, I will ask our panelists to give us their perspective for 6, 7, up to 10 minutes. And after that, we take questions through the Twitter account that has been provided. So once again, thanks for all of our distinguished panelists, Ambassador Blackwell, Madam Chavez, and Dr. Sheehan, to take the time to be with us today, and allow us to start with Ambassador Blackwell. Go ahead, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. In an instance, the Security Council of the United Nations and President Obama and those who crafted this agreement, better known as P5+1, have changed the nature of the negotiations that we were engaged in. If we could just imagine that the negotiations as we had it before this agreement was struck was a very competitive, intriguing, and high-stakes chess match. We know that we had the regime in Iran in a very precarious and weak position. With this decision and with the action of the United Nations Security Council and the surrender of the Obama administration, we changed overnight this to a situation of Russian roulette, a very deadly game where the advantage was shifted to the regime in Iran, regardless of or irrespective of their past behaviors. I think that while the Obama administration has repeatedly insisted that it preferred no deal to a bad deal, what they have now is a bad deal that they are moving forward with. The alternative for the United States Congress is to stay the course insists that it will not uh, lift the sanctions, even though if we hold it in place, those sanctions in place that are U.S. controlled, it won't be as strong of a regime of sanctions as if we were operating as a responsible community of nations. We in fact can still begin to change the balance of advantage in these negotiations. But if the Congress rolls over, if the President and Secretary Kerry pushes this present deal through and resists the voice of the people in America, the voice of the resistance in Iran, and those across the globe that stand for freedom and human rights, we will see a very dangerous situation where we will be witnessing a nuclear race in the Middle East that totally changes the composition of the so-called neighborhood in the Middle East, and we will in fact put our various countries at greater risk. There is no doubt that the present regime has not negotiated in good faith over the last 39 years, but particularly over the last 15 years. They've broken every promise that they have made, and now to grant them not only resources that props up their regime and their practice of violating human rights, we in fact will find ourselves in a situation where they can continue their push towards hegemony in the Middle East and their financing of terrorism globally. So the question before us in our country and before our Congress is whether or not we will stay the course. I believe that right now there's the will to stay the course, but it will not be without a very vociferous American public speaking out, demanding that they do so.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Blackwell, for your insightful remarks. Do we have Madam Chavez online?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Could you kindly share with us your insight, please, given your years of experience in Washington?
Well, I think that what is very interesting about what we have just seen is that it is very clear that President Obama, even as a candidate, proposed that he, at that time running for office in 2008, said that he wanted to reach out to Ahmed Ahmadinejad, he wanted to reach out to Fidel Castro, he wanted to reach out to Kim Jong-il. He wanted to sit down and clearly make agreements with some of the most vicious dictators in the world. And he has stayed that course. He went into these negotiations with the absolute requirement that a deal be reached. And what is unfortunate is, just as Ambassador Blackwell has suggested, when the negotiations began, the only reason that the mullahs in Tehran were willing to allow the government there to sit down with the United States was that Iran is in desperate straits. The sanctions have, in fact, worked. They have done great damage to the Iranian economy. The Iranian people are fed up. They've shown that by, at great risk to themselves, taking to the streets, demonstrating, even though doing so imperils their safety and can end up having them imprisoned. So he went to the table with an adversary that was in a weak position. Now, normally when you are in negotiations and you are the person who has something that the other party wants, which is a deal to lift the sanctions so that $100 billion in assets be unfrozen and trade be able to continue, then you are in the position of strength. And the United States was in the position of strength. But instead of using that position to get a deal that actually dismantled Iran's nuclear weapons building capability, instead of doing that, essentially the Americans rolled over and acceded to most of the demands of the Iranians. So what we have now is a very bad deal. And it's reminiscent of the last time we tried to deal with a adversary that was pursuing nuclear weapons that was a great threat to the world, and that was North Korea in 1994. And in that time, we reached a deal with North Korea, which they obviously violated. They are now a nuclear power. They now not only have nuclear weapons, but are perfecting the delivery means to be able to deliver those nuclear weapons against the United States, against others in Asia. And we're going to see exactly the same thing happen in Iran. And what that means is that instead of making the world a safer place, instead of removing yet another potential nuclear power, and one that is a great threat not only to the region, but really to the world, it's the chief sponsor of terrorism. So instead of removing that threat, what we have is that we are giving them the ability to move ahead at the very best. If you believe that the Iranians will, in fact, abide by every term that's in the agreement, and I, for one, do not believe that, but even if you accept that, all this does is delay Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But we know, and certainly the National Council of Resistance of Iran knows very well, because they have been exceedingly good at exposing the Iranian regime and exposing the various secret facilities and the nuclear program in Iran. What we know is that the Iranians do not intend to follow this agreement. And therefore, what's going to happen is you're going to have other countries in the region that feel threatened, countries like Saudi Arabia, many quite wealthy countries in the region that are quite capable of beginning to pursue nuclear programs of their own. So we're going to end up not just with a nuclear-armed Iran, but we could end up with a Middle East in which virtually all of the major players have nuclear weapons. So this has made the world a very, very dangerous place. And the question is there anything that can be done about it? From my point of view, it is extremely important that Congress say no to the president. For one thing, he has acted unilaterally. He decided to pursue this not as a treaty, which would have required ratification in the United States Senate. Instead of doing that, he simply acted with his executive authority, and then again, instead of trying to wait until Congress had acted to go to the United Nations to seek approval, he reversed it. And that has upset many members of Congress. This isn't a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's very clear that the Republicans in Congress are likely almost uniformly to say no to this deal. But in order to abide by the rules of Congress, they really are going to need to have 2/3 of both houses of Congress, both the Senate and the House, to be able to withstand a presidential veto, because the president has made very clear that he doesn't feel that he has to in any way defer to Congress. So the next 60 days are going to be very important. It's going to be very important to get allies on board in the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party, because this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue of grave importance to the United States and grave importance to the world. So my hope is that in the next 60 days, all of those who care about this issue will be in communication with members of Congress and will try to do their best to stop President Obama from doing something which is gravely, gravely jeopardizing the security of the world. Thank you.
Thanks for your very, very encompassing observations. Now we go to Professor Sheehan, and given your expertise, uh, we will be most appreciative if you focus a bit on the regional aspect and the impact in the region and the fallout in the region.
Well, good morning from Washington, D.C., and good evening and afternoon to those of you tuning in from Europe and the Middle East and around the world. It's a pleasure to join this very distinguished panel. Our conference today comes at an historic moment when bipartisan legislators in the U.S. Congress must decide whether they have any role to play in addressing what is widely acknowledged as the most significant security challenge of our time, a rogue Iranian regime on the verge of acquiring nuclear weapons. We know that Tehran is a major destabilizing factor in the region and a major source of havoc and crises in the region. This is a regime that has been actively involved in all three major wars in the region. They're the primary sponsor of Bashar Assad's murderous regime, a source of sectarian violence in Iraq, and the central state sponsor of terrorism globally. And these are important points as Congress readies itself to evaluate the potential of a nuclear deal intended to create peace. Now, here in Washington, D.C., there's a great deal of speculation about how best to evaluate the preliminary nuclear agreement. And note that I'm referring to this as a preliminary agreement because the matter has only just been turned over to the United States Congress. As has been noted, over the next 2 months, U.S. officials in both chambers, the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, will have an opportunity to exercise considerable oversight and finally, at last, make their voices heard. They'll have an opportunity to reject the president's false choice between war and unending negotiations with a rogue regime. Now, over the preceding week, this contentious agreement has been referred to as both controversial and also irresponsible by leading academics and policy officials. Even Mr. Obama's defenders appear to be portraying the agreement as one carved out of necessity. And I would say that no credible U.S. official can, with a straight face, make the case that this agreement actually constitutes a diplomatic victory. In fact, as Ms. Chavez just noted, the Iranian regime is a weak and fragile state that is not in a position to demand concessions, and the U.S. has conceded far too much. Now, U.S. Senator Robert Menendez, former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, criticized the nuclear deal this week by noting that the red lines the U.S. initially drew have turned into what he calls green lights. He said in a statement, quote, "I'm concerned that Iran will be required only to limit rather than eliminate its nuclear program, while the international community will be required to lift all the sanctions, and the agreement doesn't even provide for any time, any place inspections of suspected sites," end quote. Now, in the lead up to Mr. Obama's announcement, a poll conducted by Fox News found that a majority of American voters don't even trust the Iranian regime and were deeply concerned by the administration's apparent unwillingness or willingness to grant concessions to strike a deal on the nuclear front. In fact, according to the poll, 80% of voters in the United States think that Iran cannot be trusted on the nuclear issue. Now, as someone who works on matters related to Iran policy and studies the regime's activities, I can assure you that their concerns are well placed. But in an effort to pressure legislators in the U.S. Congress, the White House sent this agreement to the United Nations Security Council this week in advance of congressional oversight. Now, I would suggest to you that decisions impacting U.S. national security should never be turned over to international bodies before they've had key input from elected officials in the United States. Now, the White House has urged Congress to judge the Iran deal on its merits, and I think they should. Now, if I was giving the Iran agreement a grade, it's very simple. I'd fail it. The fact of the matter is that this agreement is distinguished only by the extent of its appeasement and the extraordinary nature of the concessions granted. Mr. Obama is making a profound mistake by treating the Iranian regime as a fixture of the Middle East landscape and ignoring the aspirations of the Iranian people. Aspirations for freedom, aspirations for liberty, a desire for human rights and a more just and peaceful future. But Congress need not make this same mistake. The best option from my perspective is reaching out to the Iranian people, and in particular the organized resistance, as a source of real change. Now, given the weak and fragile nature of the clerical regime change from within, a topic that I've written extensively about over the last few years, is a possibility. And it's in fact a better solution than kicking the nuclear can, so to speak, down the hill for another 10 to 15 years while we allow the regime to further consolidate its influence in the broader Middle East. Now, to be clear, as has been noted, this is a bipartisan issue. Republicans will find concerns, Democrats will have concerns. There's plenty to pick apart in this arrangement. But congressional oversight will require leadership on the part of Republicans, and it will take courage on the part of Democrats to now break with the president's leadership. Congress is, from my perspective, right to be angry that it hasn't been consulted. And the American public is right to be skeptical of an agreement that has been forged behind closed doors with a regime that is widely regarded as the most significant state sponsor of terror in the modern world. The regime that has total disregard for human rights of its own citizens, and a regime that even continues this week to portray the U.S. As an enemy. Now, as an academic, I have a responsibility to go where the facts lead me and to work with evidence. So if you'll permit me to make just a few preliminary observations based on the facts. Number one, the agreement put forth by Mr. Obama does not prevent the Iranian regime from having nuclear weapons capability, and no amount of political spin can make this so. Number two, the agreement maintains and legitimizes Iran's nuclear infrastructure with some limited caps for the next 10 to 15 years. But it ultimately allows the regime to build an industrialized nuclear program with little limitations in just a decade. Under this agreement, the time to nuclear breakout is not reduced, and the goal set by the president of a nuclear-free Iran is ultimately not realized. Number three, under this agreement, the Iranian regime is not prevented from research and development on advanced centrifuges. The agreement also fails to provide, and this astounds me, unfettered, anytime, anywhere access to suspected nuclear sites that we know a great deal about due to the revelations from the National Council of Resistance of Iran. Now, if the nuclear oversight is anything like these negotiations, we know the regime will delay and prolong and ultimately manage access to the site such that the very purpose of even these limited inspections will be undermined. This would be like allowing professional athletes with a record of cheating to control the circumstances that govern their testing for controlled substances. It's absurd. Now, if the regime is given notice of inspections and several weeks lead time to destroy evidence, lie and cheat, and ultimately conduct cover-ups, this defeats the very purpose of the inspections in the first place. And so I have very deep concerns about the extent to which the U.S. has rolled over on the necessity of unfettered inspections by the international community. Number 4, after almost 2 years of negotiations, the agreement does not include any specific arrangements to inspect the sites that have even been sought by the IAEA. Number 5, as has been noted, the huge infusion of cash that will come with lifting of sanctions will, I think, be used to fuel the Iranian regime's terror machine. The sanctions relief will ultimately boost the regime's ability to continue its rogue behavior. And finally, the agreement provides weapons and missile trade relief in 5 and 8 years, respectively, concessions that will only further consolidate the regime's influence in the broader Middle East. So what we see in this agreement is concession after concession after concession. And what we see looking ahead is a more dangerous Middle East. So in closing, this preliminary agreement is deserving of intense scrutiny and oversight by the United States Congress and foreign policy experts in the United States and around the world. This oversight should be bipartisan. The president has himself asked for the agreement to be reviewed on its merits. As I said, I'd give it a failing grade. But Congress must now determine for itself whether their lack of input and the disregard shown by the president toward them even merits the courtesy of ratification. And finally, the discussion of the nuclear agreement should in no way be separated from simultaneous discussions, ongoing discussions of the regime's deplorable human rights record, their sponsorship of global terrorism, and the destabilizing influence they continue to play in the region. So I thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts on the nuclear agreement with you. I look forward to your questions and comments and the comments from my fellow distinguished panelists. Thank you.
Thank you for your insights. We have had literally dozens of questions already, but allow me to ask one question and whoever wants to pick it up. The main argument that President Obama himself has and his aides have repeatedly said is that the choices are either to accept this deal or the other option is war. That's the main narrative that he has said time and over, including his last press conference, which he stressed this point. Now, is this a valid argument or there are other options? Who wants to take on that one?
Well, it's not a valid argument because the other option is to continue the sanctions. And the continuation of the sanctions will, in fact, bring this regime to its knees and to its ultimate defeat. But let me just thank my distinguished panelists because I've been keeping a sort of a scorecard as we've discussed this topic this morning. And so Iran gets billions of dollars in cash, billions of dollars in gold, billions of dollars in petrochemicals, even billions of dollars in automobiles, enriched uranium for one bomb, 3,000 new centrifuges, one plutonium reactor. And what do we get? Looking at it from just the narrow U.S. standpoint, 0 centrifuges dismantled, 0 ounces of uranium shipped out, 0 facilities closed, no delay in plutonium reactor, no stopping in missile testing, and ultimately we get no stop in the abuse of human rights and terrorism. And so I think if we go forward with this bad deal, we put ourselves in a situation where we will get more of the same, and that is more terrorism globally and more abuse of human rights at home.
Another question that has been raised by a lot of critics, and that's going to be my last question, then we go to the questions that has come in from a lot of reporters, is they make a lot of parallel between this agreement and the North Korean agreement. And the result of North Korean case is evident, as I think Madam Chavez raised that. Madam Chavez, do you think this is a fair comparison? Because the Obama administration maintains that, look, we have learned the lessons and we are not going to repeat that mistake. Do you think they have a valid case?
No, because one of the reasons that we've had such failure with North Korea is that, in fact, it was impossible to verify what the North Koreans were doing. And nothing in this agreement allows the kind of 24/7 inspections that President Obama promised when he first put forth the idea that we were going to have an agreement with Iran. He said that their nuclear sites would be available for open inspections without notice. We would have the ability to go in any day of the week, 24 hours a day, and simply go in and verify that they were, in fact, keeping their promises. Well, there is a 24 provision in this agreement. There's a very long bureaucratic maze that inspectors have to go through in order to be able to get access to the sites, and that maze can take 24 days, according to this agreement, not 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, open inspections, but rather we ask permission to go in. They, can fiddle around with it, and 24 days later, we may or may not be able to go in to see what we wanted to see. And during that time, of course, things can change. Programs can be repurposed. You can make it look like, well, this is really more peaceful than it was. And this allows the Iranian regime an opportunity to violate. So I think what we learned from North Korea was that if you don't have absolute and total access to what's going on, and you don't have a mechanism to enforce that you're going to get violations. And instead of learning that lesson, we are repeating the same problems with Iran, and in fact, we're formalizing it.
So allow us, if you don't mind, we go to the questions. We have plenty of them, and we obviously are very short on time, so I'll appreciate the very succinct answers. We have a question from Madam Hada Fatwan. She is from an Algerian TV, Al Nahar. A question I think, if I may address to Professor Sheehan, but give us a limited answer. The reporter asked, what are the impact in the region as you see this agreement? And then she asked another question that I will raise after you had a chance to respond to this one.
Sure. So I'll just pick up with the theme you raised in your final question there. From my perspective, there's a need for U.S. legislators to reject this false dichotomy between war on the one hand and unending diplomacy or negotiations on the other. This is a crafty political maneuver on the part of the president to create this false choice for the American public and for U.S. elected officials. But it's just that. It's a false choice. We know that sanctions were bringing the Iranian regime to its knees. They should ultimately be enacted again. But we know that the regime will ultimately be brought down not by external powers, but from within via the organized Iranian opposition. And I would suggest to you that regime change from within constitutes a third option, one that's not currently on the table, but one that U.S. officials should look at closely. Now, to turn to this, I think, very good question from the journalist in Algeria. We know that the Iranian regime plays and has played for decades a destabilizing influence in the broader Middle East, and they're looking to consolidate their influence through the acquisition of nuclear weapons, nuclear technologies. We know that they're a source of confusion and sectarian violence in Iraq. We know that they are intimately engaged in backing up Bashar Assad's murderous regime, as I noted. And we know that they are even disregarding the human rights of their own citizens. There's very little in the Middle East that ultimately can't be traced back to meddling by the Iranian regime. And so this is something that the U.S., who has an interest in a peaceful Middle East, a stable Middle East, should look at closely in the coming weeks as they evaluate the merits of this preliminary nuclear agreement.
And a journalist from Al-Akhbariya TV in Saudi Arabia, the main news channel in Saudi Arabia, has raised a question about the upcoming visits by European delegations, apparently the French foreign minister, to Tehran, and they say, what kind of a message would that have for the international community and for the region? Madam Chavez, Mr. Sheehan, Ambassador Blackwell, whoever wants to take that question.
Well, you know, my grandmother didn't graduate from high school, but she was one of the first diplomats that I ever came in contact with. And she understood a very basic principle, and that is that if you reward bad behavior, all you get is more bad behavior. And I would suggest that this sends the wrong signal to a regime that it is at the center of global terrorism and on the verge of becoming a nuclear power with our aid and our hugs and kisses. At the end of the day, the reason that this deal still remains a bad deal is because it dismantles sanctions and it does not dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure. And that's a bad deal. And any rewarding of that deal is an accomplice to the negative aspects of the situation, not a deterrent or a solution.
Mr. Mustafa Amara from Pan-Arab newspaper Az-Zaman has raised the question that the Obama administration has maintained that they are trying to they have closed all the pathways for Iran to get the bomb. What are the loopholes that you think still exist that allows Iran to get the bomb? Madam Chavez, do you have any insight?
Well, first and foremost, something I've already mentioned, that Ronald Reagan, who negotiated one of the most important strategic deals on nuclear weapons with the then Soviet Union, said, trust but verify. The problem with this agreement is there is no verification, no reasonable verification. The idea that if, in fact, we are able to find out that the Iranians are cheating, that we can then, as the president calls it, snap back the sanctions, that is unlikely. It was very difficult to get these sanctions put in place in the first place. So the idea that we can go back to the status before we had is just simply not likely. But the other problem is that when we agreed to this deal, the original proposal was that there was going to be a dismantling of the centrifuges that are capable of producing material to be able to make a bomb. That is not being done. And no centrifuges are going to be destroyed as a result of this. They are going to continue to be able to enrich uranium and plutonium, although it will be supposedly at lower levels. Again, without the ability to verify that, they will begin to make progress. And the deal says that the parties will not have access to any military sites, and obviously those are the sites that are the most dangerous. So I just think that There is nothing in this deal that should give us comfort, and there is a great deal in the deal that should cause us to worry.
The same journalist has asked a question that some people contend that Tehran has been somewhat limited in its nuclear aspiration. Is there any validity on this, or the trade-off has been absolutely unacceptable? That Iran has given up too little and has gained too much? Anyone who wants to take that question?
Well, I don't know where they have given up too much. We've laid out in our discussion today and in our previous, in the previous negotiations and the framework of those negotiations with the regime, and that is, we do not want them to have the capacity to build a bomb. So, the reality is that anything that opens the door or allows the floodgate to open for them to rush and accelerate in their attainment of a bomb is just a bad deal. But I want to take this opportunity to say that I want to ask the president, what's the rush? He's trying to embarrass the Congress through so-called international shame to rush to sign on to this bad agreement. But if we take our time and we read it, colleagues of mine who have gone through this line by line pointed out to me that the second paragraph of the resolution 2231, merely calls upon member states to take such actions as may be appropriate. It does not bind them, and I think that we should point this out to the Congress, that there is nothing in this agreement that binds them to surrender to a bad deal. And so we have to keep the pressure on the Congress to stay the course.
Ambassador, if I could just pick up with that theme that you just raised, I think the reason it's so hard to identify where the loopholes are in this agreement is that there are so many loopholes. It's probably easier to identify where there are not loopholes. It's also hard to do as the president has suggested and evaluate this on the merits because there are so few merits. And Congress needs to, I think, take that into account as they consider next steps.
Mr. Abdul Sattar Hatit from Pan-Arab newspaper Ash-Sharq Awsat, probably the most prominent Arab daily, says that some experts assess that after this deal, actually Tehran's meddling and transgression in the region will exacerbate, and it will have a reverse impact on Tehran's behavior. What is your insight on that, if we may start with Professor Sheehan?
Well, we know that just by virtue of these 2-year-long negotiations, the Iranian regime has taken the world hostage and delayed inspections over the past 2 years. And now they have won a series of extraordinary concessions in this preliminary agreement. And so they have every reason to now, in the near future, ramp up their destabilizing influence in the Middle East and turn up the heat at home as well. I see no reason why they would not. And so that's a great concern that I have. I would prefer to do, as Chavez was suggesting, negotiate from a position of strength and leverage U.S. influence to curtail the Iranian regime's influence in the Middle East. But I think we haven't done that in this particular case.
But what's really interesting about this is that even while Iran's economy was faltering, even while its people were suffering because of the sanctions, Iran was still quite capable of supporting military intervention and meddling throughout the region. We have the Quds force on the ground in Iraq. We have Iran supporting the terrorists in Yemen. We have Iran supporting the Assad regime in Syria. And we have Iran being still the major sponsor of terrorism around the world. And that was when Iran didn't have any money, when Iran was suffering because of the consequences of the sanctions. So imagine what's going to happen now when suddenly Iran can export its oil, when Iran's assets have been unfrozen, when it basically will be able to have access to billions of dollars more money. They obviously, when they were willing to do it, when it meant greater suffering for Iran, imagine what they're going to do as the Iranian regime and the Iranian economy's condition improves.
Before I go to the next question, allow me to, go ahead, Ambassador, sorry.
I just wanted to just to tie in, and again, having been a mayor of a major U.S. city, I walk neighborhoods and I talk to people and I hear how everyday people sort of view the world. And I remember 2 years ago talking with a member of the Iranian diaspora in the United States, and this was a woman who was a senior citizen. And she said something to me that I didn't know was universally understood, but it was something that my grandmother again used to say, and that is, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." And you know, the mullahs and this regime in Iran has bamboozled, has fooled, has lied to the international community, not twice, but dozens and scores of times. And this is not shame on them, it is shame on us if in fact we put ourselves in a position to be weakened and lied to and abused once again, and particularly the mothers and grandmothers and fathers and grandfathers in Iran there who are at the spear's tip of their repression and disregard for human rights.
Before I go to the next question, we should not lose sight of the fact that we have a very, very attentive audience joining us from Stockholm, Sweden, who have been listening very attentively in this conference, and I would like to express my profound appreciation for their patience and their presence. Before I go to the next question, the same journalist asked, and I think you already addressed this, the premise is that there will be more finance by Iran for terrorist groups in months after the funds are released. And he was wondering if our panelists will concur with that observation.
Absolutely.
Oh, yes, I agree.
Absolutely, no question about it.
Now we have a question from Dasman News from Saudi Arabia. I think we touched upon this on several occasions on this panel already, but nevertheless, since he asked the question, what is the biggest challenge now for this deal to go ahead? Who wants to take on that?
Well, I would like to think that if the Congress, the U.S. Congress, engages in credible and rigorous oversight, that the biggest obstacle will be proving now to Congress, because the burden of proof is, from my perspective, on the president, proving to the Congress that this agreement, this preliminary agreement, actually has some merit, and that it is an ingredient for a sustainable peace moving forward. My sense is that Congress will see through that, and they will recognize that appeasement and concessions are not the ingredients for sustainable peace.
I would concur in that, and I would say, yeah, if Congress does put up a united front and does object to this, and that we get essentially a veto-proof vote on the resolution on this measure, that it will be a clear signal to the administration that their position is untenable. Obviously, there's going to be an election next year, and in 2017, a new president will take office. Now, normally in the case of foreign affairs, you want continuity from one president to the next. You want a policy that is negotiated to be accepted by the next administration. But if, in fact, Congress were to vote this down, I think it would be an opening for a subsequent administration to back out of the deal. Unfortunately, by that time, there'll be 2 more years, and Iran will be that much closer to a nuclear weapon, if not already having produced the material for a weapon. So, unfortunately, the situation is very dire. It is very difficult to contemplate how we are going to be able to stop this. And I think the president has done a great disservice to the American people by not going through the normal process of making this a treaty which allowed Congress to vote it up or down.
You know, one of the recommendations that I heard, sorry, Ambassador.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
One of the recommendations that I heard earlier this week at a meeting, and I think it's one worth looking at, is to not accept the president's word that this is a good agreement, and to not accept the Iranian regime's word that it will live up to its commitments, but instead, within the United States Congress, to set up a mechanism to allow for another source of intelligence, a credible source of intelligence that comes via the organized Iranian opposition. We know that the National Council of Resistance has provided time and again credible intelligence that the world has consumed and has acted on. And Congress should look at that and consider the merits of consuming more of this on-the-ground information from the organized Iranian opposition as it considers or evaluates this agreement.
Ambassador Blackwell, you want to interject?
I just believe that we have to keep our focus on what is possible. It is possible for 2/3 of Congress to reject this agreement. If, in fact, they reject this agreement, President Obama would be acting in a manner that's inconsistent with U.S. law if he tried to waive the sanctions, unilaterally. The fight would be engaged, and I think we win that. We must, again, understand that that second paragraph in the resolution 2231 is not binding. The United States Congress does not have to lift these sanctions. And if they vote not to, I think we then start to raise an example that for the rest of the world to see that there is still a resistance both inside of Iran and outside, and that the United States of America has taken its rightful leadership position to bring this regime to its knees and to stop its global financing of terrorism and its abuse of human rights at home. This is very important. The other thing that I think it's important for us to understand within the context of international relations and domestic political consumption at home is that this deal puts the U.S.'s, one of the U.S.'s #1 allies, the State of Israel, at serious risk. And I think that has to be underscored as they deliberate over the next 60 days and then ultimately take a vote.
A journalist from As-Siyasa Daily from Kuwait says, what are the ways that you think Tehran can circumvent its commitments to this agreement? Madam Chavez, would you like to take that question?
Well, I think there are a variety of ways. One of the ways is to have, as they already have, sort of blocked out access to military installations. So we don't know what's going to be going on in those facilities. The other is, what this whole deal was premised on was the idea that we would stop Iran from producing enough fissile material to produce a bomb, but there is a threshold, and the question is, at what point are they in a breakout position? And as I said earlier on, at the very best, if we believe everything that's in this agreement and that Iran is going to follow the letter of the law, it still really only delays their building a nuclear weapon. So I think I'm not a nuclear physicist. I can't, tell you exactly the ins and outs of what it is they're going to do. I can simply say that given past experience, given our experience with North Korea, and given our experience with Iran in the past, the chances are they are going to violate this. They're going to hide their programs. They're going to move things off-site. They're going to compartmentalize their research in such a way that they may have different parts of the research and the development going on in different facilities, and that at some point all of that comes together. There's no question, they've made it very clear that they want to pursue nuclear weapons. I mean, that's not a mystery. They have not really hidden that from anyone. And the only question is how quickly that's going to happen and whether there's anything we can do to stop them. And unfortunately, this agreement will, at the very most, only slow them down, and only for a very short time.
Two journalists, one from Saudi Arabia, from the Dasman News, and another one from Ahlan Arabia, have asked about the response from the commander of Revolutionary Guards, who basically had a very harsh tone for this whole deal, and particularly the UN resolution. And they said, what does that imply so far as the Iranian regime's inside mechanism is concerned? Professor Sheehan, do you want to take on that one?
Well, we know that at the same time that the Iranian regime has sent abroad to engage in negotiations its best diplomats and its finest face, they have at home been engaged in fierce rhetoric that is anti-American. And we need only look at the Supreme Leader and the broader clerical regime and the Quds Force to examine this rhetoric. And so, from my perspective, the U.S. Congress should consume these statements and take them as they're presented, as threats, and decide whether or not the U.S. can engage in a negotiated agreement with an actor who's engaged in such fierce rhetoric. Look, this president himself, and I don't have the direct quote here, but this president himself referred to not just the destabilizing influence that the Iranian regime plays, but also the Iranian regime as a primary state sponsor of terror in the modern world. Just a few months ago, this president himself has been concerned by comments that have emerged from the Iranian regime during these negotiations. And so I think at some point the U.S. Congress needs to take these statements and look at them for what they are.
We are really pressed for time, but we have got a few more questions left, and I'll try to be very succinct. A journalist from a news website from Iraq has said, what do you think the position of the Western powers should be vis-a-vis the human rights situation in Iran? Shouldn't they be more vocal in condemning human rights abuses in Iran? And this deal should not be an excuse for more silence vis-a-vis abuses inside the country. Ambassador Blackwell?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. The Obama administration has basically boxed off any consideration of human rights by saying that this agreement has a narrow focus on matters of nuclear capacity and Iran's threat to become a nuclear actor. Well, that's in itself. They haven't done anything that really is going to curb that activity, and they've turned a blind eye to the human rights violations both domestically and the acts of terrorism financed by Iran globally. At the end of the day, the administration has constructed an international stage or forum that plays to the deception of the mullahs in Tehran and the regime that is advancing towards a goal of hegemony in the Middle East neighborhood. So look, I think it is up to us, both the organized resistance and human rights leaders throughout the globe, to shine a very bright light on the nature of the regime at home and its violations of any decency and any respectful regard for human rights.
Could I just add something, Shaheen? Because, clearly we've shown no interest in the human rights situation in Iran in these negotiations. That was just simply off the table. It was not part of the negotiations. But one of the things that's most interesting as an American is that there are 4 Americans being held by the Iranian regime, including a Washington Post reporter who was on trial for espionage. And the Obama administration has done little to nothing about procuring the release of these hostages as well. So I think the Obama administration's record on human rights is abysmal. It's a disgrace. It really is an embarrassment.
The last question, if I may, comes from Egypt. I've got a few more questions left, but we are literally running out of time. It says, is there any validity on what Obama administration claimed that this agreement helps for establishing security and stability in the region, or the panel rejects that assertion altogether?
Yeah, I reject that out of hand, because the Saudis have already started to negotiate. They're not going to be without that capacity. So this has started a new rush towards nuclear weapons, and I think that as opposed to stopping proliferation, this will speed it up.
Madam Chavez, Professor Sheehan?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no question that this is going to lead to more weapons in the region. We already have a very unstable situation in the Middle East. We have countries that are already at war. It's not as if, we earlier addressed the question, the agreement or war. We already have war throughout the Middle East. The only difference is we don't have a nuclear war yet. But you are going to see more and more countries pursue nuclear weapons, and the question of a nuclear conflagration in the Middle East in the future is closer than it was before this agreement.
And just to bridge the last 2 questions, I would say that you cannot divorce human rights considerations from government's ability to engage responsibly on the world stage. And we know that the Iranian regime has a deplorable human rights record, and they have a track record of engaging irresponsibly on the world stage. So this does not hold promise for a more peaceful Middle East moving forward, assuming their continued influence.
It seems I made a mistake in identifying one of the papers. This one news is from Kuwait, not from Saudi Arabia. From what I can hear, we are going to have a very, very hot next 60 days. In Washington, the whole world will be watching and following. And once again, thanks a lot, Ambassador Blackwell, Madam Chavez, and Professor Sheehan for very, very insightful and informative discussion. And once again, my appreciation to our very, very attentive audience in Stockholm who joined us. And we all appreciate for their presence and their very, very active presence in listening to all of this discussion. Once again, thank you so much. And I'm sure we will be discussing this issue for weeks and weeks to come. I wish everyone a very, very good and productive day. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.